The wasteland stretched for miles, an endless sea of crumbling concrete and twisted metal. Once a bustling metropolis, it was now nothing more than a memory, its people long gone, swallowed up by the unforgiving plague that had ravaged the world. The wind whispered through the shattered remains of buildings, carrying with it the dust of forgotten lives. In the distance, the faintest hint of movement caught the eye. It was barely noticeable, but for those who knew what to look for, it was a sign. The last survivors, those who had managed to outrun the relentless undead, were out there somewhere. Eli, a weathered tracker with sharp eyes and a heavy heart, stood at the edge of a broken overpass, his gaze fixed on the horizon. His weathered leather jacket rustled as he adjusted the strap of his rifle. He had been following these survivors for days, through scorching heat and bitter cold, across barren landscapes where no man, living or dead, had any business being. But he was on a mission. The world might have ended, but there were still some things worth saving. And these survivors, the ones who had managed to carve out a life amidst the chaos, held the key to rebuilding whatever was left of humanity. Eli had seen the horrors of the undead firsthand. He had watched as whole cities fell, their streets once filled with the laughter of children and the hum of daily life, now silent and empty, save for the groans of the zombies that roamed the ruins. The virus had spread like wildfire, turning even the most unlikely of victims into ravenous monsters. It had taken everything, friends, family, even entire civilizations. But somehow, a handful of humans had survived, clinging to the hope that the world could be rebuilt, even if the cost was unimaginable. With a sigh, Eli crouched down, his fingers brushing the dirt beneath him. He could feel it, the unmistakable presence of the survivors. They had left a trail, faint but discernible. A broken water bottle here, a torn piece of cloth there. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For a tracker like Eli, it was a map, a story of the journey they had made through this desolate world. The zombies, or walkers, as they were now called, had become little more than a nuisance to Eli. He had learned their patterns, studied their movements, and found ways to avoid them. The real danger now lay in the humans, the desperate, starving, and sometimes violent remnants of society. Survivors had become as dangerous as the undead themselves, their fear and mistrust leading them to take drastic actions to protect what little they had left. Eli had been tracking these survivors for days, but today something felt different. He could sense it in the air, a shift in the wind, a change in the atmosphere. The survivors were close. Very close. His instincts, honed over years of survival in this broken world, told him that they were just beyond the ridge, hidden somewhere in the ruins of what used to be a thriving neighborhood. He stood up, adjusting the rifle slung across his back, and began to move, his steps cautious and deliberate. As he walked, memories of his own past began to resurface. He had not always been a lone wanderer. Once he had a family, a life filled with the promise of a future. But the apocalypse had taken that away, as it had taken everything else. The faces of his wife and children flashed in his mind, their smiles forever frozen in time. They were gone, just like the rest of the world's population, consumed by the relentless hunger of the undead. Eli had long ago given up hope of ever seeing them again. His only purpose now was survival. The journey had hardened him, shaping him into something different from the man he had once been. He had become a shadow, a ghost haunting the wastelands, always on the move, always looking for the next sign, the next lead. He had learned not to trust anyone, not even the survivors he tracked. He had seen too many betrayals, too many alliances forged and broken in the blink of an eye. In this world, trust was a luxury no one could afford. But something about these survivors intrigued him. They weren't like the others. They weren't just trying to survive, they were trying to rebuild, to find a way to fight back against the nightmare that had overtaken the world. They had found a way to live in a world of death. And that, to Eli, was worth pursuing. If they could figure out how to survive in this wasteland, maybe there was hope for everyone. The first signs of their camp came into view. It was a small, makeshift settlement tucked away in the ruins of an old shopping mall, the walls reinforced with scrap metal and debris. From a distance, it looked like a fortress, small, but carefully constructed. Eli's eyes narrowed. The survivors were taking every precaution, but even the strongest walls couldn't keep out the undead forever. He had to act quickly. Time was running out. He crouched low, blending into the shadows of the wreckage. Every step had to be calculated. One wrong move, one sound out of place, and the walkers would be on him in an instant. But Eli was used to the dangers of this world. He had survived worse. The footsteps of the survivors were faint, but their presence was undeniable. Eli had found them. Now the real journey would begin. Eli paused at the edge of the ruined mall, the crumbling walls and shattered windows casting long shadows in the dimming light of the late afternoon. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of decay lingered like a constant reminder of the world's collapse. He crouched low, observing the survivors' camp from a distance, careful not to make a sound. The settlement seemed peaceful, but Eli knew better than to trust appearances. In this world, peace was fleeting, always temporary. His eyes scanned the perimeter of the camp, noting the makeshift barricades, the posted lookouts, and the cautious movements of the survivors within. They were careful, but not perfect. A single figure moved just outside the barricades, carrying a heavy bundle of wood. Eli's trained eyes studied the individual's movements, the slight hunch of the shoulders, the way they scanned the surroundings before turning back to the camp. It was a woman, perhaps in her early 30s, with dark hair tied back into a messy ponytail. Her face was hardened by the years of struggle, but there was something in the way she carried herself that told Eli she wasn't like the others he'd encountered. She wasn't just surviving, she was thinking, planning, and adapting. She was a leader, even if she didn't know it yet. Eli's instincts told him that this woman, this group, could be the key to something bigger. The questions raced through his mind. What had they seen? What were they planning? Why had they chosen this isolated patch of the Wastelands to set up camp? For a moment, his thoughts wandered back to his past, his family, the life he had once taken for granted. He shook his head, forcing himself to focus. There was no time for that. Not anymore. The survivors in front of him were the present, and perhaps even the future. His future. Eli took a slow, deliberate breath and moved to a better vantage point, slipping between the ruins as silently as a shadow. His rifle remained slung over his back, and his every step was measured to avoid any unwanted attention. He needed information. If he was going to make contact with them, he had to know more: who they were, how many they were, what they could offer. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. Trust was a dangerous game in this new world. As he neared the entrance to the camp, the sound of voices drifted through the air. Low, cautious murmurs, the kind that only come when people are trying to avoid detection. Eli slowed his pace, ducking behind the remains of an old vending machine. His heartbeat quickened as he strained to listen. "We can't keep going like this," a voice said, raspy but firm. Eli recognized it immediately as the woman's. "We're running out of supplies. We need a plan. Something bigger. We can't survive on scraps forever." There was a long silence, followed by a second voice. This one was deep and gravelly, with an edge of frustration. "We've survived this long, haven't we? We don't need some grand plan. We just need to stick together." Eli narrowed his eyes, trying to make sense of their conversation. They were discussing something important, but he couldn't quite piece it together from just these few words. Still, it confirmed his suspicion. This group wasn't just wandering aimlessly. They were trying to build something. But what? And why here? His mind raced through possible options. Should he reveal himself now? Wait until nightfall? It was too risky to approach them openly without knowing more about their capabilities. He needed to gather information first, learn about the others in the camp, and see if they were truly as capable as they appeared. Suddenly, there was a sharp sound, a clatter of metal hitting the ground, followed by a startled shout. Eli's heart skipped a beat. The walkers. They were coming. Without hesitation, he dropped to a crouch and pressed his back against the wall of the ruined mall. His fingers wrapped around the grip of his rifle, his eyes scanning the perimeter for any sign of movement. From the direction of the noise, he could hear the unmistakable groans of the undead, their guttural sounds reverberating through the air. The survivors were in danger. Eli's mind shifted into overdrive. This was no time for careful observation. The time for action had come. He darted out from behind the vending machine, moving swiftly but silently toward the sound of the commotion. His breath came in sharp bursts as he sprinted through the dusty streets, navigating the maze of ruins with the ease of someone who had been living in this broken world for far too long. As he rounded a corner, he saw the first of the zombies, a lanky figure with tattered clothing, its movements slow but determined. A quick glance told him there were more. A small group, shuffling toward the camp, drawn by the sound of the survivors' conversation. Eli didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle, took aim, and fired. The first zombie dropped, its head exploding in a burst of decayed tissue and bone. The others turned, startled, but too late. Eli moved with precision, his shots quick and efficient, each one finding its mark. But there were too many. The undead just kept coming, as if they were endless, a tide of rotting flesh and decaying humanity. The survivors had no time to react. It was up to Eli to save them, whether they wanted it or not. The survivors weren't expecting it, none of them were. They had been caught off guard, their attention distracted by their own conversations and the pressing issues within their camp. Now the undead were upon them, drawn by the noise of the scattered supplies, the sudden chaos that erupted in the heart of their settlement. Eli moved quickly, each shot ringing out in the silence of the ruined wasteland. The survivors, still frozen in shock, watched as the zombies fell one by one, their heads snapping back under the impact of his bullets. Eli didn't pause to assess their reaction. There wasn't time. The walkers were too close, and more were coming, drawn by the stench of decay and the sound of the conflict. He moved with purpose, clearing the immediate vicinity with methodical precision. His rifle barked again, dropping another undead before it could reach one of the survivors, a man who looked too young to be caught in a fight for his life. Eli's eyes flicked toward the woman he had seen earlier, the one with the sharp eyes and the natural air of command. She had her hands on a makeshift weapon, a rusted pipe, but she wasn't moving. "Move!" Eli shouted, his voice urgent, his body already in motion as he circled around to the back of the group. He hadn't meant for them to hear him, but it was the only way to get them moving. "Get inside the barricades, now!" The woman snapped to attention at his command, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and disbelief. She hesitated for just a moment, her mind racing to process what was happening. Then, instinctively, she ran. The others followed, some of them with the same frantic urgency, while others were still dazed, their minds struggling to keep up with the sudden turn of events. Eli turned to face the next wave of zombies, his rifle raised. He fired again and again, each shot precise, dropping the undead in their tracks before they could close the distance to the survivors. He wasn't thinking about the risk, he was thinking about survival. His job wasn't done until they were safe, even if they didn't know it yet. The woman, now inside the makeshift barricades, turned back to the fight, her expression filled with anger and confusion. "Who the hell are you?" she shouted, her voice hoarse, the fear still evident. Eli didn't answer her right away. He kept firing, each shot carving a deadly path through the undead, but his eyes kept flicking to her. There was something about her, a rawness, a resilience that intrigued him. She wasn't like the others he'd encountered. She was a survivor. But she was also a leader, whether she realized it or not. When the immediate danger had passed and the last of the zombies dropped, Eli took a slow breath and lowered his rifle. He was exhausted, his muscles screaming from the effort. But he couldn't afford to show weakness, not yet. Not in front of these people. "Get inside," he told them again, his voice less urgent this time, but still firm. "Lock everything down. Now." The woman hesitated again but finally moved, her eyes flicking over to the others, who were still in a daze, trying to make sense of what had just happened. One of the survivors, a man in his 40s, came forward, gripping a shotgun tightly. His face was lined with dirt and exhaustion, and his expression mirrored the confusion of the others. "You saved us," the man said, his voice shaking slightly. "But who are you?" What do you want? Eli glanced over at the woman, who was now helping a younger survivor, a teenage girl, into the shelter. The girl's face was pale, her eyes wide with shock. It didn't look like she had ever seen anything like this before. The world they knew was a far cry from the nightmare Eli had been living in. I'm not here to make trouble, Eli said, keeping his tone neutral. I'm just passing through. Passing through? The woman's voice was sharp now, cutting through the tension in the air. She had come back outside, still holding the rusted pipe, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. You're just passing through, and you happen to be exactly where we need help? You think we're stupid? Eli didn't flinch. He had heard this kind of accusation before, and he had learned the hard way that the best response was silence. People didn't trust easily anymore, and why should they? In this new world, alliances were fragile, built on necessity rather than friendship. He wasn't expecting their gratitude, and he wasn't interested in their suspicions. I've been tracking you for days, he said finally, his voice steady but low. You and your group. I know what you're doing out here. The woman's eyes flashed with a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. What we're doing? You're following us? Why? Eli looked away for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the camp. The walls were sturdy, but the cracks in the foundation were already starting to show. The survivors had set up a stronghold here, but it wouldn't last forever, not in this world. I'm not here to fight, Eli said. But you need help. I've seen what you're doing, trying to survive, trying to rebuild. You can't do it alone. There was a long silence as the woman processed his words, her face unreadable. Eli could see her weighing the options in her mind, trying to decide if he was a threat or a potential ally. But in the end, it didn't matter. This wasn't a choice she could make alone. She had people to consider. I don't know you, she said at last, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. But if you want to help, then you'd better start explaining exactly what you think you can offer us. Eli nodded, his gaze sharpening. This wasn't the easy road he had imagined. But then again, nothing about this new world was easy. He could see the first hints of a partnership, fragile, tentative, but a partnership nonetheless. But whether it would survive the trials ahead, he couldn't say. Not yet. The air inside the camp was thick with uncertainty. The survivors had gathered around a crude fire pit, the flickering flames casting long shadows over their faces. Eli sat on a fallen beam, keeping his distance from the group. The woman, still holding the rusted pipe, had taken a seat on a nearby crate, watching him closely. Her eyes were sharp, calculating. She hadn't spoken much since his rescue, but her silence wasn't one of fear, it was the silence of someone processing, analyzing, and deciding what to do with an unknown quantity. The man who had first spoken to Eli, the one with the shotgun, was pacing near the fire. His name was Owen, and Eli could tell that he was the closest thing to a leader in the group, though he seemed to lack the quiet authority that the woman exuded. Owen had a protective air about him, and it was clear that he cared deeply for the others. His eyes flicked between Eli and the woman, as if waiting for someone to make the first move. Finally, the woman broke the silence. My name's Harper, she said, her voice steady but cold. And this is my group. We've been surviving here for months. What do you want, Eli? Eli was surprised. He hadn't given her his name. It seemed that Harper had already made up her mind about him. He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. I'm looking for something, he said, his voice low. Not something you'd have. But you're surviving here, maybe longer than others. I need information. Away to the west. I heard there's a settlement. Harper raised an eyebrow, her gaze flicking over to Owen and then back to Eli. You've been following us for days, she said. And now you want us to help you? You think we're just a means to an end? Eli didn't flinch. Not a means to an end, he replied. I'm offering something in return. I know these wastelands better than most. I know the areas you haven't dared venture into. I can help you survive, longer than you think. A murmur went through the group, but it wasn't the type of excitement Eli had hoped for. It was the kind of reaction you got when someone made an offer that seemed too good to be true. "We don't need a guide," Owen said, his voice gruff. "We've been doing fine on our own." Harper raised her hand, silencing Owen with a simple gesture. "And what happens when those supplies run out?" she asked. "What happens when there's nothing left to scavenge, when the walkers are at the gates and we've got nowhere to go?" Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Eli could see the doubt creeping into the survivors' faces. They had survived this long, but Harper was right. This world didn't give you much hope for the future. "I'm not promising you a perfect solution," Eli said, his voice steady. "I'm not offering safety. But I can help you get out of here, find something better. I've seen what's left of the world. I've seen places that still have food, shelter. But you can't stay here forever." Harper's eyes narrowed. "And why would you do that?" she asked. "What's in it for you? You said you were looking for something. What is it?" Eli paused. He hadn't meant to reveal too much, but the question had caught him off guard. "It's not about what's in it for me," he replied quietly. "I've already lost everything. I'm just trying to survive like you." There was a long silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Harper was studying him closely, as if trying to determine whether he was telling the truth. Eli could see the uncertainty in her eyes, the way she was torn between trusting him and keeping her guard up. "All right," Harper said finally, her voice calm but firm. "We'll take you up on your offer. But you'll have to prove yourself. We don't trust easily." Eli nodded, relieved but not surprised. Trust was always the hardest part of any deal in this new world. But he had learned long ago that survival depended on finding allies, even if those allies weren't always willing. And Harper's group was capable. They had survived for months in a world that had swallowed so many others. They weren't weak. Owen, who had been listening quietly, shot Harper a look. "You sure about this?" he asked, his voice low. Harper met his gaze without hesitation. "We don't have a choice," she said. "We need help." Eli's eyes flicked between the two of them, sensing the tension that still lingered between them. It wasn't a simple agreement. They were wary of him, and rightfully so. But the moment Harper had spoken, Eli knew he had crossed a line that marked him as either an ally or a threat. "All right," Owen said, though there was still a trace of reluctance in his voice. "But if you're lying to us, if we find out you've been hiding something, we'll deal with you ourselves. No second chances." Eli gave him a nod, acknowledging the unspoken challenge in his words. He understood. He wasn't here to make enemies. Not yet, at least. Harper turned to face the group. "We need to get organized," she said, her voice commanding. "Eli's right. We can't stay here forever. We've been on our own too long. We need to find better shelter, and that means working together." The group slowly nodded in agreement, and Eli felt the shift in the air, a subtle but important change. They weren't fully trusting him yet, but they were willing to give him a chance. "We start tomorrow," Harper added. "We'll need to make plans for the journey. No one goes off alone." Eli stood, ready to follow her lead. "I'll be here at dawn," he said. "I'll show you the way, but we need to be prepared. This won't be easy." The group scattered, each person going to their respective corners to prepare for the next day. Eli stayed where he was, his mind already working ahead. They had agreed to help him, but he knew it wasn't going to be a smooth ride. Nothing ever was. Harper was right about one thing: their survival depended on what came next. And Eli was determined to make sure they survived. The first rays of the sun stretched across the barren wasteland, casting long shadows over the remains of what was once a thriving civilization. The camp was already stirring, the survivors preparing for a journey that would take them deeper into the unknown. Eli had been awake for hours, sharpening his rifle and checking his supplies. His focus was unwavering. He knew this journey would be difficult, and while he had offered his guidance, the truth was he wasn't sure what they would find out there. Harper approached him just as he finished packing his gear. She moved with purpose, her expression still guarded but more resolute than before. She had made it clear the previous night that trust wasn't something given lightly in this new world. She wasn't about to place her life in the hands of a stranger without proof. "You ready?" Harper asked, her voice steady but carrying the weight of someone leading a group into danger. Eli met her gaze. "As ready as anyone can be in this world," he replied, securing his rifle to his back. Harper nodded and turned to the rest of the group, giving them a brief set of instructions. "Everyone, check your gear. We leave in 10 minutes. No one goes off alone, and keep your eyes open. We don't know what's out there." The survivors, a small group of 10 in total, began moving with purpose, checking their weapons and gathering whatever supplies they could carry. They had made the decision to travel light: water, ammunition, food, and any tools they might need. Anything else was left behind. Eli fell in line behind Harper as she led the group out of the camp. The air was dry and hot, the dust swirling around their feet as they trudged forward. The path ahead was uncertain, the horizon distant and hazy. There was no telling what dangers awaited them, but Eli had a sinking feeling that the worst was yet to come. The group moved in silence for the first few hours, the only sounds being the soft crunch of their boots in the dirt, and the occasional cough or murmur from one of the survivors. The wasteland stretched endlessly before them, a stark reminder of the world they had lost. The cities they had once known were now crumbled ruins, swallowed by time and the insatiable hunger of the undead. Harper kept a steady pace, her eyes scanning the horizon, always alert. Eli noticed that she was more than just a leader by title, she was an experienced survivor, someone who had weathered this storm for longer than most. He couldn't help but respect her resolve, even if he still wasn't sure where her loyalties truly lay. As they moved farther from the camp, the landscape began to change. The desolate plains gave way to more treacherous terrain, rocky outcrops and dry, cracked earth. The group slowed as they navigated the uneven ground, careful not to make any noise that might attract unwanted attention. Eli kept his distance but remained within sight of the group. He was there for guidance, but he also understood the importance of letting them lead. Harper had built this community, and it was her decisions that kept them alive. His job was simply to help them survive the next leg of their journey, and perhaps, if they got to that point, show them a way out of this wasteland. The first sign of danger came when one of the survivors, a young man named Sam, stumbled. He cursed under his breath as his foot caught on a loose rock, sending him sprawling forward. Harper whirled around instantly, her eyes flashing with concern, but she held back from rushing to his aid. "You okay?" she asked, her voice calm but commanding. Sam grunted, pushing himself up from the ground. "Yeah, just a misstep. I'm fine." But Eli knew better. He had seen it before, fatigue setting in, stress building. The human body could only endure so much. Sam wasn't as fine as he claimed. "Don't push yourself too hard," Eli warned from the back of the group, his voice carrying on the wind. "You don't want to wear yourself out too soon." Harper gave him a brief look, her expression unreadable. "We've got no choice but to keep moving," she said, and then addressed Sam directly. "If you need a break, say so. We're not running a marathon here." Sam nodded, though his face was pale, the weight of the journey already taking its toll. Eli watched him carefully, noting the subtle signs of strain. They couldn't afford to have anyone fall behind. Not now. The group continued on, but the atmosphere had shifted. The silence that had once been calm was now charged with tension. Every crunch of gravel beneath their boots seemed amplified, every gust of wind louder than before. The wasteland around them felt alive with hidden dangers, and Eli couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. As the hours passed, the sun beat down relentlessly, adding another layer of discomfort to their journey. The survivors had begun to fall into a rhythm, each person taking turns checking the rear of the group, scanning the horizon for any signs of danger. But despite their vigilance, no one spoke about the real threat, the undead. It wasn't just the walkers that they feared. It was the land itself. The landscape was unforgiving, with no mercy for the weak. And in a world like this, the living could be just as dangerous as the dead. Harper stopped suddenly, raising her hand in a signal for the group to halt. Eli's eyes darted to her, his heart rate quickening. Had they found something? A sign of life? Or worse, a sign of death? Harper's gaze was locked on the distant horizon. There, she said quietly. Do you see that? Eli squinted, trying to make out what she was pointing at. In the distance, just barely visible against the barren landscape, was a small structure, a building, maybe a barn or a shack. It was isolated, standing alone amidst the desolation. A murmur ran through the group. Could it be a safe place? Could it be a trap? We need to check it out, Harper said, her voice resolute. But we move carefully. We can't afford to get caught off guard. Eli's eyes never left the building. His gut told him that whatever they found there would change everything. They weren't alone. And they were about to find out just how much danger that small structure held. The group moved cautiously toward the distant structure, their footsteps slow and deliberate. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. The light was fading, and with it came the oppressive sense of urgency. They couldn't afford to camp out here without knowing what lay ahead. The wastelands were dangerous after sundown, and the thought of spending the night exposed made everyone uneasy. Harper led the way, her eyes scanning the surroundings as she kept her rifle ready. Eli followed closely behind, his instincts on high alert. The building grew larger as they approached, its details becoming clearer, a dilapidated shack with a crumbling roof, its walls patched together with makeshift materials. It was the kind of place that might have once been a refuge, but now it looked more like a trap waiting to spring. Keep your distance, Harper whispered, her voice barely audible. We don't know who or what's inside. Eli nodded, tightening his grip on his rifle. He had seen what desperation could do to people. In a world where survival was everything, it was just as likely that they would encounter hostile survivors as they would the undead. As they neared the building, Eli noticed the door was slightly ajar. The wind howled through the gaps in the walls, sending dust swirling around them. It was eerily quiet, the only sounds coming from the occasional creak of wood in the wind. The structure seemed deserted, but Eli wasn't fooled. Nothing in this world was ever as it seemed. Stay sharp, Harper ordered, signaling for the group to stop. Sam, you and Eli take the left. Owen, cover the right with me. Sam, looking slightly more alert than before, nodded. He moved to Eli's side, and together they crouched low, using the natural cover of rocks and debris to approach the building from the left side. As they moved, Eli's mind raced, weighing every possible outcome. If this was a trap, they needed to be ready. But if it was a shelter, it could be the break they needed. Harper's voice broke the silence again. On my signal, we move in. Don't rush it. Eli glanced at Sam, who was still visibly exhausted but trying to keep pace. Stay close, he murmured, his voice low. Keep your guard up. Sam didn't reply, but Eli could tell he was trying to focus, his hand twitching around the handle of his machete. It was clear he wasn't comfortable with the idea of entering the building. None of them were. Harper's signal came, and the group moved in sync, their steps light but swift. They reached the door, and Harper, with a sharp motion, pushed it open. The hinges groaned loudly, and for a moment, it felt as though the entire world held its breath. Nothing happened. The inside of the shack was dark, the only light coming from the fading rays of sunlight that filtered through the gaps in the walls. The floor was covered in dust and debris, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. A single piece of furniture, a rickety table, stood in the center of the room. It was otherwise empty. Eli's eyes scanned every corner of the room, searching for signs of life or death. The walls were bare, save for a few pieces of old, yellowed paper pinned to the wall. It looked like someone had been here recently, but there were no immediate signs of danger. Still, Eli remained tense, ready for anything. Clear, Harper whispered, her voice low but firm. She stepped into the room, her rifle still raised as she surveyed the interior. Eli followed her inside, Sam close behind. Owen, along with the others, remained outside, covering the perimeter. No one let their guard down, not even for a second. As they examined the shack, they discovered a small stash of supplies tucked away in a corner: canned food, bottles of water, a few medical supplies. It wasn't much, but it was more than they had found in days. The group began to gather the provisions, carefully checking for expiration dates or signs of tampering. This could be a turning point in their journey. Harper crouched by a crate in the corner and rummaged through it. She pulled out a few pieces of worn clothing and a bundle of blankets. "Not much," she muttered, "but it'll do for the night." Eli couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Despite the supplies, there was an unsettling emptiness to the place. It was as though someone had been here but left in a hurry. The thought sent a chill down his spine. "Any sign of anyone else?" Sam asked, his voice nervous. Harper shook her head. "No. But we need to stay vigilant. We don't know who or what could be out there." Eli stood by the door, peering out into the fading daylight. The wasteland was quiet, too quiet. His instincts told him they weren't alone, that the peace they were experiencing right now was temporary. But whether it was another group of survivors or something more dangerous, he couldn't say. As the last of the supplies were gathered and the group began to settle in for the night, Eli found himself lost in thought. He wasn't a man given to superstition, but the feeling that something was watching them persisted. The wasteland had a way of turning even the smallest comforts into dangerous lures. It was as though every quiet moment, every glimpse of shelter, was a trap, an illusion of safety before the storm. Harper was the last to settle, sitting by the fire they'd started outside the shack. She kept her rifle close, her eyes scanning the perimeter. Eli could see the exhaustion in her posture, the weariness that had settled in her bones. But she didn't let it show. She wouldn't. She couldn't afford to. As the night grew darker, the wind picked up, howling through the cracks in the building. The others were already asleep, but Eli remained awake, watching the horizon. The emptiness of the wasteland was oppressive, a constant reminder that they were alone, truly alone, in this broken world. Tomorrow, they would move on. But for tonight they would rest. At least, that's what they told themselves. But Eli knew the truth: in the wastelands there was no such thing as rest. And the danger was never far behind. The night passed in uneasy silence. The wind had picked up, and the sound of its howling through the gaps in the shack kept everyone on edge. Eli lay on his makeshift bedroll, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. He could feel the weight of the wasteland pressing down on him, a constant reminder that they were barely scraping by, living on borrowed time. He could hear the faint rustle of movement from the others as they tried to rest, but no one was truly comfortable. Not here. Not in this place. Harper was sitting outside, her back against the wall, eyes scanning the horizon. She had positioned herself as the first line of defense, keeping watch over the camp while everyone else slept. Eli could see the fatigue in her posture, the way her shoulders slumped slightly as she fought off the need to close her eyes. She wasn't one to show weakness, but it was clear that even the strongest among them had their limits. The crackling fire outside was the only thing breaking the stillness, its light dancing on the walls of the shack. Eli could smell the faint scent of burning wood, mixing with the dry, dusty air. The warmth of the flames didn't reach him here inside, but it was enough to give the group a sense of comfort. A false sense of security, perhaps, but comfort nonetheless. Eli knew they couldn't stay here for long. They had to keep moving. The longer they remained in one place, the higher the chances of something, or someone, finding them. He had seen it all before: survivors who stayed too long in one spot, growing complacent, thinking they were safe, only to be blindsided when the worst came knocking. He sat up and rubbed his eyes, the weight of the journey settling heavily on his shoulders. His gaze drifted toward the door, half expecting to see something, or someone, waiting in the darkness. But the wasteland was empty, as it always was. The sun had only just begun to rise, casting a faint light across the wasteland, and already Eli felt the tension in the air. The world around them was shifting, and the danger they had been avoiding for so long was about to catch up with them. He could feel it in his bones. "Harper!" Eli called softly, not wanting to wake the others. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "You're awake." "I can't sleep," he admitted, rising to his feet and walking toward the fire. "We should move out soon." Harper didn't respond immediately. She just stared at him for a long moment, as if weighing his words. Then she nodded. "I was thinking the same thing. We can't afford to stay here any longer than we have to." Eli sat down beside her, the warmth from the fire seeping into his bones. "It's not safe," he said quietly, eyes scanning the horizon once more. "It never is." Harper nodded again, her gaze distant. "We can't live like this forever. We need to find something more than just survival." "I know," Eli replied, his voice low. "But I'm not sure that something exists anymore. All we have is each other, and whatever we can scrounge up along the way." Harper's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue. She knew he was right. The wasteland offered no promises of hope, only the endless march of survival, one day blending into the next. Just then, Sam stirred inside the shack, groggily pulling himself upright. He rubbed his face and glanced around, looking for any sign of danger. When he saw Eli and Harper outside, he slowly crawled out from under the blankets, his movements sluggish but deliberate. His exhaustion was clear, but there was determination in his eyes. "Morning," he mumbled, yawning. Eli gave him a nod. "Morning. Get some water and check your gear. We're moving out soon." Sam didn't protest, though his shoulders sagged as he went about his morning routine. The others began to stir as well, and within minutes, the camp was alive with movement. It was a silent, efficient routine, gathering supplies, checking weapons, and preparing for the next leg of their journey. There was no time for small talk. No time for rest. Harper stood, stretching briefly before turning to Eli. "We head north," she said, pointing toward the horizon. "There's a settlement there. We've got to find it before the next storm hits." Eli didn't question her decision. He had no better idea of where to go, and she was the leader of this group. The survivors had placed their trust in her, and Eli had decided long ago that he would do what he could to help them find some semblance of safety. The group began to pack up, moving quickly and efficiently. Sam was still sluggish, but his resolve was beginning to show through the haze of fatigue. He had a fire in him that hadn't been there before. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was fighting to live. As the group set off toward the north, Eli kept his eyes peeled for any sign of danger. The landscape remained unchanged, dust and rocks stretching endlessly toward the horizon. But something felt different today. There was a strange energy in the air, a sense that something was waiting just beyond the edge of their vision. They hadn't gone far when Harper raised her hand in a signal to stop. Her body tensed, her eyes scanning the distance with practiced precision. Eli felt his heart rate quicken. He knew something was wrong. "What is it?" Sam asked, his voice low. Harper held up a finger to her lips, signaling for silence. "I don't know yet," she whispered. "But I don't like it." The silence stretched on, the air heavy with anticipation. Eli's senses were on high alert. The wasteland around them had always felt like a vast, empty space, but now it felt alive, like something was watching them from the shadows. And then they heard it. The low rumble of distant footsteps. Not just one set. Several. The sound was growing closer, and Eli knew that whatever it wasn't going to be friendly. The sound of distant footsteps grew louder, and the group's tension intensified. Harper's face tightened, her eyes narrowing as she assessed the situation. Eli's grip on his rifle tightened instinctively, and the others huddled together, instinctively moving closer to Harper for guidance. "Stay low," she whispered sharply. "Whatever it is, we're not ready to fight just yet. We need to keep moving quietly." The group began to move again, this time at a hurried pace but with the utmost caution. Each step was deliberate, avoiding any unnecessary noise. The footsteps in the distance seemed to be echoing across the empty wasteland, but they were still far enough that they hadn't spotted the group yet. "How many do you think there are?" Sam asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Harper didn't answer immediately, her gaze fixed on the horizon as she scanned the area for cover. "Too many to be safe," she replied finally, her voice calm but strained. "We're not taking any chances." Eli glanced over his shoulder, trying to gauge how close the approaching threat was. They couldn't see anything, no figures, no movement. But that was the problem. In a wasteland like this, danger didn't always announce itself with clarity. It could be hidden just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of dust and decay, and for a moment, Eli thought he saw a figure in the distance, a blur of motion just at the edge of his vision. His heart skipped a beat, and his breath caught in his throat. He wasn't sure if it was his mind playing tricks on him, but something told him they were about to face their worst nightmare yet. Suddenly, a sharp cry echoed from behind them, a screech that sent a chill down Eli's spine. It was a sound of desperation, of someone, or something, on the brink of madness. He turned around quickly, his pulse racing. A group of figures appeared, their movements erratic and unnatural, stumbling toward them with alarming speed. Their clothes were torn, their faces gaunt and hollow, and their eyes burned with a wild, hungry intensity. Eli's stomach twisted. These weren't just survivors, they were zombies. The group had underestimated the speed at which the horde could gather. These weren't the slow, lumbering creatures they had encountered before. No, this was a faster, more aggressive breed, a new nightmare in the wasteland. "Run!" Harper shouted, her voice cutting through the air like a command. "Now!" Without hesitation, the group turned and bolted in the opposite direction, their feet kicking up dust as they scrambled to put distance between themselves and the approaching horde. The wind howled behind them, the sound of pursuit closing in with terrifying speed. Eli's heart pounded in his chest, the adrenaline surging through his veins. He had no idea how many of them there were or how far they had to run, but there was no time to think. The wasteland offered no shelter, no safe haven. They were exposed, vulnerable, and the only way out was forward. "Keep moving!" Harper shouted again, her voice rising above the chaos. "Don't look back!" Eli pushed himself harder, his legs burning with the effort, but he couldn't slow down. Sam was just behind him, panting heavily, his face pale from exhaustion. But they couldn't afford to stop. Not now. As they ran, the wasteland seemed to stretch endlessly before them, the horizon never getting any closer. The horde was gaining on them, their growls and shrieks echoing through the desolate landscape. Eli didn't dare look behind him. He knew that if he did, the fear would take over and he might not be able to keep running. Just ahead, a small ridge loomed, and for a moment it looked like it might offer some shelter. A place to hide, a chance to regroup. Without thinking, Eli veered toward it, his heart racing. "That way!" he called to the group, pointing toward the ridge. Harper, though clearly exhausted, didn't hesitate. She followed his lead, urging the others to follow. They scrambled up the ridge as fast as they could, each of them desperate to get to higher ground. When they reached the top, they quickly ducked down behind a line of rocks, using them as makeshift cover. The horde reached the base of the ridge just as the group found shelter, their growls echoing through the air. But the group was safe, for now. The wind howled again, and the wasteland seemed to swallow the noise of the pursuing zombies. Eli pressed his back against the cold stone of the ridge, gasping for breath. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. "How long do we stay here?" Sam whispered, his eyes wide with fear. "As long as we need to," Harper replied, her voice steady despite the tension in her shoulders. "We can't move yet. They're too close." The group sat in silence, their breathing the only sound as they waited for the horde to pass. Eli's heart was still hammering in his chest, his hands shaking slightly as the adrenaline wore off. He glanced at the others, his eyes meeting Harper's. She gave him a small nod, as if silently acknowledging their shared understanding. They had made it through this close call, but it was just that, a close call. In the wasteland, survival was never guaranteed. And as they sat there, watching the zombies below them, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The wasteland was far from done with them. Once the last of the horde shuffled away, their figures disappearing into the distance, the group slowly began to move again. They couldn't afford to wait too long. The wasteland was a cruel, unforgiving place, and as much as they had hoped for a moment of respite, the truth was clear. Every step forward in this world was a battle. But for now, they had made it through the worst of it. They had survived, yet again. And that was all they could hope for. As the sun began to rise higher in the sky, casting its harsh light across the barren land, the group moved forward once more, their eyes set on the horizon. The wasteland stretched out before them, a silent witness to their struggle. But for now, they were still alive. And that was enough. I hope you enjoyed the conclusion. Let me know if you need any adjustments or further content.